Hey team, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we are going to write a full application that will perform the following. As you can see from this image, I have a grid with two buttons for edit and delete, and a button on top to add a new item. So it looks like I have a data entry control that is used for that data entry. Lastly, you see a file that contains JSON. So in the big picture of things, we're going to build a JSON file. I will be using Newtonsoft exclusively to serialize, take the C# class object and build a JSON file, and then deserialize that same object and read it back from JSON to my C# code. Pretty much, I will perform the CRUD operations on this JSON file. Insert new record, edit a record, delete a record, and I'm constantly reading records. Hence, that's called CRUD. Hope you enjoy this video. As you can see, I'll be using XAML for the layout. Here you can see I have a grid, the column definitions and row definitions for this control. There's going to be a lot of state management. Here you can see not only do I change the title bar, but I also changed the caption on the button. Don't worry about the source code right now. We're going to get plenty of that, but I just wanted to show you how easy it flows. Our resource file using the styles has about 108 lines of code. There are a few things that you may learn, and hopefully you'll be able to appreciate them. Are you guys ready to do this? Let's do it. Let us create a project. File, new, project. And notice the drop-down combos here. C#, Windows Desktop. Let's look for WPF Application. Hit next. What is the name of our app going to be? Well, it's going to be called Json, CRUD. And because this is kind of like my second app, I have to put a V2 on mine, but don't do that for yours. Just call your Json CRUD. We're going to be using .NET 6. Now that we have the basic things set up, what we need to do now is get a NuGet right away. Let's do manage NuGet. And notice the browse button, then come over here and say Newtonsoft. And before you can say Skippy, it's found it. Let's say install and say OK. And if you come up here to your project dependencies, packages, you'll see Newtonsoft. And that's step one, team. Click on the file called app.xaml. And this file that we see here is where we have our application resources. This is a very, very important file. And throughout the code, I'll be coming back here and showing you how we do that. But for now, all we have to do is type this in. Notice that it begins on kind of like line 8 and stops on line 26. Press pause now and type all that in. Let me know when you're ready to continue. And here's our next set. It begins on line 28 and stops on line 50. We have 3 new styles. Press pause now. Notice the code begins on line 53 and ends in 74. We have 3 new styles. Press pause now. Let's get that typed in. And these are the last 3 styles. 80 to 103. We have 3 new styles. Let's get them typed in, and then we can start using these in our source code. The very bottom of this file ends with application resources and application. Now we have finished up with app.xaml. It's now time to create 3 folders: app code, controls, and model. Press pause now to continue. In models, we have 3 class objects. Let's start with CRMCS. Notice we have 6 fields. Each one of these fields has a data type, a get set, and 3 of them I'm going to assign string.empty to it. These are all public. The class name is CRM. Get that typed in, hit pause now. Our next object, CRM DTO, data transfer object. Now I'm going to be using this to assign it to a grid. Notice I've got some fields called like selected index and display create date. Well, I'm going to format them outside of this and just assign it to the list. I don't want to have to go in there and figure out, how to make a pretty date. I'm gonna make a pretty date in this object right here and then call it quits. Let's get these 6 fields all typed in. Press pause now. UI type, it's got 3 members, an UI create, UI edit, and a UI delete, 0, 1, 2. Get that typed in, press pause, let's continue. And there you have all the code that will be necessary for the folder models. Let's now work on app code CRM CRUD. Here are the methods that are actually gonna save the JSON to disk, translate that JSON text file to a C# class object, and then go the opposite way. So from a C# class object to the text file so we can save to disk. So here are our methods. Notice we'll begin here with our usings. Notice we have 7 statements. Let's get those written in. Press pause now. We will create a global variable list CRM ? That means it's nullable. In fact, right away I assign null to this list, friends of mine. Then we have our constructor. Our constructor says load JSON from disk. Let's see what happens there. Let's read what I wrote here. So this deserializes the list. Load JSON from disk is just a text file. Then deserialize, translate from JSON text to C# class object. This diagram shows you we start with JSON, we run it through Newtonsoft deserializer, and then it gives us the C# class object. That is the goal. Load JSON from disk. This is the JSON. This is just raw text. Now, this is a JSON format, but this is just a text file. So it's going to be easy to see where each of these fields go to the particular C# class object. As you can see, ID goes to ID, first name to first name, last name to last name, cell phone number to cell phone number, create date to create date, and last touch date, last touch date. There's one important thing about each of these. This word has to be that word, but it's not case sensitive. So just because you see a capital F here and a capital N, we don't have to have that in the translation. They just have to be the same word and the same data type. And that's how you will have success. Let us begin with load JSON from disk. Well, you can see I'm going to go out to that folder, YouTube, C#, JSON CRUD data, my data JSON. That's this file. Notice the path, YouTube, C#, JSON CRUD data, my data JSON. I'm going to make sure that file exists. And if it does exist, I'm going to deserialize that object. Notice list CRM is the way that file is defined. I'm going to read all that text, run it through this deserializer, and guess what? I now have a list. Now, if that list not equal null, I'm going to assign what I read to friends of mine. Remember, friends of mine comes from the top, line 13. Now, if that right there had no data in there, I'm just going to make that an empty list. Now, if file exists is false, I'm just going to make friends of mine an empty list. And that is the method load JSON from disk. Our next method, save JSON to disk. Now notice our input now is this memory variable C# class. I want to serialize that object. So I'm going to convert C# to JSON. And then I'm going to save that JSON to disk. So make sure that folder. I'm then going to serialize that object. And that's going to turn it into that text. And it's going to look like JSON. I'm going to make sure that file exists. And if it does exist, let's remove it. And then I'm going to write all that text, that JSON, to this file name. Then return true. And there you have save JSON to disk. Press pause, get all that typed in. Our next method, get all display data. Let's take a look at that. This method is used to take it from just the CRM object, you know, the friends of mine, that's the list of CRM. And now I'm going to turn that into CRM DTO. And the reason why is when I apply it to the grid itself, I just want to put the values in here and don't worry about it. Don't worry about converting it to a different, like a visual state. For instance, notice here on create on, this is the way I want it to be shown. Now, if you go look at the individual file, notice create date has the UTC time in it. Well, I don't want to see that. In fact, I don't want nothing to do with the time. I just want month, day, and year. So that is why I'm using DTO. So let's build a new list of type CRM DPO, and then friends of mine count, loop over this many times. Now you'll notice here I say select is 0, index is 0, and then I increment that index per loop. So start at 0, but notice I have one field on my CDO called selected indexed. Let's see how I use that in the form. Notice that when I select an item, the row appears to be selected. That is called selected index. If I change the selected index, notice that blue line follows around my selected index. And I get that from this display object. Stay in the loop. When we're all done, let's return all. All is a list of CRM DTO. Now, if I don't have any friends, I return null. Let's type in line 63 to 92. Press pause now. And here we're at the heart of this class. Notice that we have JSON file insert, update, and delete. The reason why I start that off with JSON file is because it's actually a file that I'm going to put new records into. I'm going to update a record, and I'm going to delete a record from this file. In the beginning of this, the return data type of both of those, all three of these, is a tuple. This tuple consists of two values, a success and a nullable array of strings. If success is true, errors is null. If success is false, you will get a list of errors. JSON file insert, I'm passing in one row, one object, one person, and then I come in there, load JSON from disk. You know what this does. It loads up all the data. I'm then going to use that friends of mine, and I'm going to try to find this record by ID. ID is like our primary key. Notice in the list, our IDs is a GUID, and each of these values is unique. Remember, I'm trying to do an insert, so when I pass in a user, I'm expecting that not to be in this list. So does that ID equal what I sent in ID? Now, if that test equals null, that is the perfect case. It does not exist. So let's add it to our list. Let's save it to disk. Now, if there's problems, let's report the problem back to the user, or let's return true, no problems. Now, if we try to insert a user and that object ID already exists, we get into another situation where that already exists. So let's build an error message and let's return that to the user. And there we have JSON file insert. Let's type all the code in. Let's go from line 94 to 122, press pause. Let us continue with 123 down to 130. That gives you all the source code for JSON file insert. Press pause now. On JSON file update, think about this for a moment. We're updating. That means we want the record to exist. We're going to change it. So I'm passing in a person. I load all the data, and then I say, go find that one person. Now, if tests not exist, that's a problem. I want to find someone, so this should not be null. Now, if I do find somebody, I'm going to take the first name, last name, and cell phone number, and I'm going to assign it to task, and I'm only going to update last touch time. I'm going to save that out, return error message if necessary, or return true and null. Now, if I cannot find your friend, that's a problem. So I'm going to say your friend does not exist. We cannot do an update on somebody imaginary. Let's type all this source code in. Let us go from 132 down to 159. Press pause. Let's continue with 159 down to 171. That finishes JSON file update. Press pause now. Our last method, delete, well, before we even look at the source code, you tell me, what are we trying to do? Does the record already have to exist? Yes. Then we can remove that person. So I have to load up all the data, find that one row, remove it, and then write that JSON file back out. That's what we have to do. Let's see the code. Guess what we do? We load all the data. We try to find the person we're trying to remove. If we found them, let's remove it by object ID. Object ID is like our primary key, what makes each row unique. Once I do that remove, I'm going to save that JSON back to disk. I may have some issues, so show the user the error, or return true and null through the return value. Remember, the return value is a tuple, has two variables, a Boolean success and a nullable array of strings. Now, if I did not find that user to delete, well, it's because that person is not in our table, in our JSON. So I'm going to show that error message as well. Notice I'll return false and another error message. Let's begin on line 173 and go down to 201, press pause, and we will finish up with our 203 to 210. And that is all the source code for the class object CRM CRUD. Okay team, you have successfully typed in CRM CRUD. Notice that we have 212 lines of code. Let's just go through this one more time, top to bottom, make sure you have all the source code. Let's do this. Let's begin on line 1. Let's go down to line 23. Press pause now. Continue at line 23 and let's come down to line 46. Press pause now. Let's continue at line 47 and let's come down to line 69. Press pause now. Continuing at line 69 to 94, press pause now. Let's start at line 94 and come down to 122, press pause now. Let's continue with 123 and come down to 150, press pause now. Continue from 150 down to 179, press pause now. Continue at 179 to 208, press pause now. And 208 to the end of the file, you have 212 lines of code. And there you have CRM CRUD. You have all the source code. Congratulations. Let's add the data entry control now. So click on right click and then say add, and then notice it says user control. Let's click on that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give it our name and we're going to say data entry control. And notice that is a user control WPF, and then hit the add button. We're now ready to start working with the folder control. Notice that we have our control XAML and then our code behind. Our XAML code is quite easy And let us just click this button right here to swap the GUI with the source code. Let's do that. So there's the source code, and let's just go to the top. You shouldn't have to change anything here, but notice here we're going to say the design height 450 and the design width 400. And then we're going to say grid column 2, grid row 2, style, static resource, data entry border. Notice this is a border control. Let's see how we use that styling in app.xaml. Let's go look for data entry border. So I was able to find that my target type border, notice the key data entry border. Notice it's got a corner radius of 4, border brush of black, and the thickness of 2. And that is what I'm calling data entry border. I apologize for doing this if you're very proficient with programming, but for the beginners, notice that when I say style static resource equals this data entry border, what it's really doing is doing this right here. It's assigning all of those properties to your border. So when I go and look at this, notice it's got 3, corner radius, border brush, and border thickness. It's kind of doing what I did here, putting the values here. Now, the beautiful thing about having them inside of this file is I get to share them. And it cuts down the amount of typing that I have to do inside of this one. So I just thought I would give that to you. I'm not sure if that helped anybody, but if it did, leave a comment below and let me know if those kind of tips are worth me telling. As you can see here, this black line that goes around, notice I got rounded corners. That is the border that we just coded up. I will now be creating a grid, and look at its resource name. Its resource name is Data Entry Control Grid. So now you're starting to see how these work. So I'm using a column definition of 128 and 272. So there's my 120. My 8 I kind of use as gutter, and then I have a 272. Here is data entry control grid. Notice vertical alignment, horizontal alignment, background, visibility, and width. I don't have to stick that in my XAML. Let's keep it clean. Now you can see I have a collection of row heights, row definitions. So grid.row definitions, 5010, 5010. So as we come down, notice I got gaps in between of all of these, and I use them for spacers. So, my form looks okay. I'm sure there's other ways to do that, but that's the way that I was taught. And that's the way I am teaching you. Notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The first row is, we say, sub-0. And the columns are 0 as well. So this is 0, 1, 2. We start off with this header, insert new record. You see that right here. Row 0, column span 3. So the name of this is called TB. I wonder what that stands for. Text block, service description, insert new record. Now notice here it has a static resource. Now that comes from app.xaml. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other properties associated with this, but for the front end, that's all I need to know. That's on grid row 0. Now on the next one, notice grid row 2, we have the ID. You can see that. So notice it just goes down the board, ID, first name, last name, and cell phone, right? Just right down the board. And then notice our next set is the text box control. So we first were looking at these labels. Now we're going to work down this side and put in the data entry controls. Notice that we have our TB ID. That's for that unique identifier. Then we got our first name, our last name, our cell phone number, and those are all of our fields. Let me pull that back down there so you can type all that. So we'll begin here. Get the column definitions, press pause. Get the row definitions, press pause. Get the text blocks controls, press pause to continue. Then here we have our 4 input text boxes to capture information from the user. ID, first name, last name, and cell phone. 2, 4, 6, 8 in our rows. Press pause. Now at the bottom of that screen where we have insert record and cancel, we're going to put that inside of a stack panel. And notice that we're going to put that on line 10, 2 underneath the row for cell phone. So a button that says insert, a button that says cancel, a click that says I want you to call this method if they click on it, click on button cancel if they click on that. And notice we come to the bottom and it says grid border user control. So we just finished all the XAML for our user control. I'm going to go back up to the top. We're going to go down so many lines and let's make sure that we have in all 83 lines of code. Let us look from lines 1 to 20, the end of grid column definitions. Press pause. Let us continue from 21 to 40, and that gave us our row definitions and our first 2 text blocks controls. Let us continue from line 41 to 59. Press pause. Let us continue with the other 2 text boxes and the panel that contains 2 buttons, the insert button and the cancel button. Let's type that in, press pause, and there is the bottom of the source code. Congratulations team, you just typed in all the SQL statement, not SQL, all the XAML code for our custom user control. We're now going to type in the code behind on the data entry control. Let's make sure you start off with our usings, make sure you have 9 of them. And then we're going to come into our namespace and then our class object data entry control. It's going to inherit user control. And then notice right away I have a delegate and an event. And I actually have 2 of them. So you know those buttons that we had on our form? As you can see here, I have the insert record and cancel. So what this will happen is when I click this button, this delegate and event are going to be consumed. And when I hit the cancel button, this delegate and this event handler will be consumed. And that is why we're able to use a control that talks back to the parent form. And we do that through delegates. Now I'm going to explain this exhaustively. You will understand this 100%, and I will leave no code left unturned. You will get this, I promise. So for now, public delegate void, there is no return value, and this is just the name of our delegate. Json action handler, and it has 3 parameters. Then notice I say public event, I'm using that same name, and then I'm saying on the action handler. And then notice here, this one kind of makes more sense. I say a public delegate cancel handler, and then I'm going to make an event using that cancel handler, and I'm going to call it on cancel handler. So there's a convention to kind of say on whatever that you want to call that, but this is kind of like right now, like I'm going to pretend like you don't understand this, which is great, and then we're going to see how I use this in just a moment, but it's already typed in, so we're halfway home. Now Data entry control is my constructor. This is my class, and it's going to initialize component. This comes from Microsoft. Now we're back to myself. Notice on line 29 we said button JSON command click. That is associated with this button. When I click this button, I'm in insert mode. I'm going to be expecting some values to be in here. So immediately I say, is there a first name? If there's not a first name, I throw up a little message box and I say, hey, first name is required. And then I look at that last name and I say, hey, this last name is required. Same message. And then I'm going to check out the content of that button. The content of this button are these words that we see on the top. So think of that as like the text, but it's actually the content because I can put a lot of things there. But notice right now, I just have 2 words. Now, because it can change, notice that when I hit delete, it comes into delete record. So that content changed. If I hit edit, it says, edit record. So those are some updates. And notice not only do I update the button, but I update the header based on what I'm doing. So when I click that button, I make sure there's a first name, a last name. I make sure the content of that button is not null. If it is null, I'll return it. Now, what am I going to do? Get form from data entry. I want to go get what they've typed in from this data entry form. Let's go there and see what happens. This is pretty simple. I just create a new object. I parse in that GUID that's inside of that cell. So on the first line, I'm going to parse this value and parse GUID parse TBID text. So that value is going to be assigned an ID. And then I'm going to go get the first name, which is software, and I'm going to say, assign that to obj first name. And then in last name, nuggets, I'm then going to take nuggets and I'm going to assign it to last name. Now those are required fields, but cell phone is not required. And I'm saying, look inside that cell, and if there is some text, trim it up, take all the spaces out, and let's make sure the length is greater than 0. If it is 0, let's take that cell phone number and let's put it in here. Notice here we have a cell phone value. And now cell phone has a value. I'm going to take now and I'm going to put that in create date, and then I'm just going to return this object I just created, object CRM. So now you understand what happens on line 45. I just go get that form and I build an object, and now all those values exist in object. Now I go look at that button and I say, what do you see? What do you see on that button? So now I ask you, what do you see? Well, you see the words insert record. Now because you see insert record, I'm gonna lower everything and trim it, make sure we remove all the spaces, and then I'm gonna say, are you insert record? Nope. Are you insert record? Yes. So guess what I'm going to do? JSON insert. Now in JSON insert, look what I'm going to do. So that one object we're going to get, it was passed in here. And now you've already got the class for CRM CRUD. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a JSON file insert on that object. Now, if we look at my list, do you see a software nugget in here somewhere? Do you see this? Well, actually, it really doesn't matter what the name is. Do you see 5BB7 in here? No, you do not. So this record will be saved. And this is where we start using the delegate and event. So this here is an event. And then I would be saying, if on action handler not equal null, I want you to do this. So here I'm asking someone else is someone subscribing to this event? Is somebody wanting me to perform an action when someone wants to do an insert? And if that is the case, then this will come in here. If nobody has subscribed to this event, this code just gets bypassed. And right now, nobody has subscribed to this, so this is null. The value of that is null. There is no value. And until we code up, another form, this will always be null. And I will show you how we raise that event in just a moment. But notice for JSON insert, JSON update, and JSON delete, they are all the same code. But here you can see that I'm doing a JSON file delete, a JSON file update, and a JSON file insert. So if you could, let's type in from lines 170, set data is enabled. So here you can see I'm sending in a state, and then I'm going to toggle is enabled by that state for first name, last name, and cell phone. And then we have private void JSON insert with CRM object. Got the values here. Let's just type all that in. Press pause now. Let's type in JSON update and JSON delete. Let's press pause now. So we never finished that button JSON command. We kind of got down to where we were going to branch out and do this JSON insert. But let's go ahead and finish up this switch statement now that you understand all that code. Notice I'm just going to switch on the button type. What word do you see? Notice here I'm going to do an insert, then I'm going to do a delete, then I'm going to do an edit. So based on the words that we see here is the action I'm going to perform. On line 49, you see I'm switching it. I'm going to convert that to lowercase, and then I'm going to trim off all the space. And then if it's update record, I'm going to do a JSON update. An insert record, I'm going to do a JSON insert, or a delete record, I'm going to do a delete. And that is the end of the method button JSON command click. I'm going to start at the top here. Please press pause so we can get all that typed in. So starting on 29 down to 53, press pause. Continuing line 53 down to 68, press pause now. So there you have button JSON command click. That is a very powerful function. Now, button cancel click, look all it does. It calls, what is this called again? What word? That is called an event. So someone has to subscribe to an event for this to happen. If there are no subscribers, then this never gets executed. Type in line 70 to 76, press pause now. Now on load form, what happens is I pass in a GUID. The question mark says it's nullable. The value is ID. So I'm going to create a variable called rec. And then I'm going to say, does that ID have a value? And if it does, I'm going to take that ID.value. Because this is nullable, I have to use the word value after that. So you see how there is two properties associated with a nullable data type. It's has value and the actual value. So I'm going to say rec.id. Notice rec is from that CRM object. So now we have the CRM object and it's got an ID in it. Now, if this is null, like this came in as null, I'm just going to clear that form and then I'm going to return. Clearing the form just sets all the boxes to empty. So your ID would be empty, first name, last name, and cell phone, they're all empty. And then I'm going to return out of there. Now, if we can get by this else statement, look what we're going to do. We're going to say CRM CRUD, here's my variable, equals new CRM CRUD. Then I'm going to go out to a method that's in this object. The one that we've already written is called JSON file find record. And I'm going to pass in rec. Well, look what I did with that. I assigned rec.id that GUID. So I popped over to the CRM CRUD. I came to the method JSON file find record. Notice I passed in that object. So what does this first line do? That's right, it loads all the data up. And then I'm saying, hey, if that is not null, I want you to return that object, like all my friends. On line 90, you can see that that function is very obvious. I get all the records. And then on line 92, I'm saying, hey, all records, can you go find me that ID that I passed in? Now there's two choices. If it exists, that means I don't want to do an insert. If it does not exist, if it does exist, I want to do an edit or a delete. So I go try to find it. So if record's not null, that means I found it. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those values from that record. Remember, here's all the data. And then I'm just looking for one row. So I find the ID, first name, last name, and cell phone, and I put it into that form. That's what this does. So load form just goes and gets all the data and then just finds that one row that we need and then populates that form appropriately. This next method on line 105 is a utility function, and it's called from a lot of places to change the value of that button and the label of that control we just did. Notice it says change UI type. So now if it's edit, it's going to say edit record and then update record. If it's create, it's going to say insert new record, and then the button will say insert record. And if it's delete, it will say delete record, and then the button will say delete record. Let's actually see that work. So notice if I say new record, it says insert new record and insert record. If I click on the edit button, it says edit record, update record. And if I hit the delete button, it says delete record, delete record. So from the form, we haven't programmed the form yet. It will then call this change UI type, and then I will go update both of these values on that user control. Press pause now, continue typing in lines 105 to 128. Let me know when you're done. Our next method, get form from data entry. Now, just like we have putting it in there, like a load, now we're going to get a get. So here you can see I'm coming from the box out to an object, and my goal at the end is return an object. That is the goal. Cell phone is not required. That's why if they don't give me a cell phone number, I'm going to put a null in that value. So type in from line 130 to 146. That is getting information out of the cell phone. Our next method after get form from data entry is clear data entry form. Notice I'm just putting all the values to empty string. Then notice these methods are public. So that means from my parent, I'm probably be going through the variable to actually set these values. Notice for me to get a new text ID, GUID.new GUID, the function to string, I'm actually calling that from someplace else. So let's finish lines 149 to 161. Press pause now. So after the new record GUID, we have set data is enabled. Notice I'm just sending in a state, and that state will be assigned to is enabled. This will be true or false. Type in lines 163 to 168. And we looked at this earlier, JSON insert. I'm going to send in an object. I'm going to try to call that CRUD JSON file insert and do an insert. Notice it returns me a tuple value. And then notice that tuple value actually gets sent through my event handler. So my delegate tells me kind of like what the message looked like. The event actually executes it. So here, and if and only if someone has subscribed to this event, will this even work? It's quite possible someone does not subscribe to this. I'm going to give one example that I always use, and it is on the input type, type equals text. So this is HTML, and one of the events on there is called onBlur. And if somebody comes in there and says JavaScript lookup, it will go out there, and if someone leaves this control onBlur, then this will get executed. But see this input type, I'm gonna like imagine this as first name, you know, like I'm trying to get someone's first name, but when they leave that, I'm gonna do a lookup. But if I take this away, what happens is onBlur doesn't get called. So whatever onBlur was gonna do, that action is not required. With delegates and events, if I don't subscribe to them, then I had to code them up. Like with this one right here, you know, someone had to go code up onBlur. Someone had to do that. Okay, like me, I did it here. Now, it's me using it or not using it, that's up to the programmer. So he wants to use this or she wants to use this or not, you know, I still have to have the code there. Now, if they do use it, this is what happens. If they don't use it, it just goes around this. Nothing happens. Okay, I'm not done with this yet. So if you're still lost, I still have plenty more. And the good stuff is only coming. Let's do a Json insert from lines 170 to, let's delete a few lines here, to 180. So we got 10 lines there. Json insert 170, 180, hit pros. From 182 to 192, we have Json update. Notice we're calling that CRUD. I'm going to try to do an update on that object. I still have this. Hey, does somebody subscribe to me? Does somebody want to use me? On that input type equals text onBlur, did they give me that? Did someone type it onBlur? I want to use this. Now, if they didn't type it in, this is not going to be used. Now, I don't want you to worry about that yet. I still have the answer for this for you. It's going to be the complete circle of life. 182 to 192, press pause. And our last method in here is going to be JSON delete, and we are going to do a JSON file delete. Then once again, I have that same event problem as I have defined above. And this is just extra. We don't need that. And guess what, team? That is all the control for the code behind. I'm going to start at the top, go way down, and make sure you have all this source code, okay? Let's begin with line 1 to 23. Hit pause. 23 down to 47. Press pause. Let's go from line 48 to 68. Press pause. Let's go from line 69 down to 89. Press pause. Let us continue from 89 down to 107. Press pause. 89 to 107. Press pause. 107 to 128. Press pause. 129 to 148. Press pause. 149 to 169. Press pause. 170 to 192. Press pause. And that puts us at the end of the file, and we are all done with the control code behind. You've made it to the last file. We're now looking at main window.xaml, and of course we have the code behind. Notice that we have 152 lines for the XAML and roughly 100 lines for the code behind. Let us begin with the XAML. Notice that you come down. The only line I changed here was my name of my software, YouTube, Software Nuggets. My height is 800, my width is 1366. Then at the higher level, notice that we got an outer grid, and then inside of that grid, we've got a button, a checkbox, another grid, and then a border that I'm calling the data entry zone. Let's see what that looks like. So the button, new record, is here. The checkbox is over here. The grid is this grid down here that shows all of our friends. And then notice our border for our data entry zone is this box that we have already coded up, and that's where we can do an edit. Notice it'll change the word here, a delete record, or create a new record. So you've already programmed all that up. We're now going to be focusing on this user interface to make all of these controls work. So on line 9, we begin our grid. Now we know that we have a grid row definitions and grid column definitions. In our row, notice we have 4 row definitions, 45, 11, 530, and 90. Let's get those typed in. And then our column definitions, notice that we have a 900, a 10, and a 400. And those are the layouts of our grid. Get those typed in, press pause, let's continue. Notice that we've got our button, new record. I'm going to be calling that button, new record. When someone clicks on it, button, new record, click. On our checkbox, notice I'm calling that check show message. I'm putting the text show message to the right of that. And there you see what it looks like, the new record button and the show message. Let us now do this grid. This grid is in row 2. The height is 529, the width is 900, and notice it has a style. I've already taught you where you can get the information about that. That's out there in app.xaml. Then right inside of the grid, notice that I have a scroll viewer. It also has a style. It can also be found in app.xaml. Now, scroll viewer to scroll viewer, grid to grid, you see that. Now, inside of this scroll viewer, notice I have a stack panel. The reason why I have to put a stack panel is because inside of a scroll viewer, you can only have one control. Notice I have a grid and a list box. Those are 2 controls. So I had to wrap them with a stack panel. The grid, notice I have a label, ID, first name, last name, phone, and created on. They're inside of a grid. The width is 900. The background is light green. What I'm showing you there is this green bar that goes across that. I call that column headings. So you see ID goes to this ID value, first name, last name, phone, and created on appropriately. I keep calling this a grid, but in actuality, this is just a list. And notice it's a list box with list items. And then you'll see that we have each line is defined by a grid object. So it starts off with ListBox. The name of my ListBox is called My Friends ListBox. Vertical alignment top, horizontal to the left. List goes down to close list. ListBox item template, ListBox item template, and then we are in the data template. Now the data template has a grid, and that grid has row definitions and column definitions. Notice I only have one row definition. The height is 25. My grid definitions, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 columns. Remember, this is sub-zero. So we have a 130, 20, 270, You know what I'm putting in there, like that ID, then 110, 110, and then two 120s. Let's see what that looks like. So this 130, I'm going to put my two buttons there, and then a little spacer in between there, and then 270 gets my ID, 110, 110, first name, last name, phone number, 120, and created on 120. Each row is only 25 pixels. I think you understand the layout for the grid. Let's continue. Notice here in grid column 0, I have a stack panel. That stack panel has two buttons. Do you remember in my CRM DTO, I had one property called selected index? Guess what? That's where I use it. I'm putting that value into tag. When we're looking at the code behind, you'll see how I'll pull this off to use the selected index for this list. Then notice here for the delete button, I have that same setup. So we have our resource from static resource, we have that selected index, and then I'm going to bind the ID to the command parameter. That is in stack panel. You can see that in these buttons here. In column 2, we're going to put the ID. Notice to get the value in, we say binding the field name. This field name is from the actual object. You can notice here when I say binding ID, that comes from CDVO, DTO, ID goes to ID, first name to first name, last name to last name, cell phone number to cell phone number. And then you see here, display create date. Well, I get that here. And you see how I use selected index. Selected index was bound to the button, so I kind of know how to set the state for that line for highlighting. Let's get all the code from 109 to 130. Press pause now. After you finish the last text box, was that display create date, close the grid, close the data template, close the item template, close the list box, close the stack panel, close the viewer, and close the grid. And if you look at it at a higher level, it just all collapses on itself. And scroll viewer to scroll viewer, grid to grid. And the last little part inside of this XAML is going to be this bottom border control. That is where we're going to be putting our control to do their data entry. Notice that we say border. The name is going to be called data entry zone. Notice that I have a style. You can go out there to app.xaml and read about what's in there. Then notice I have just an empty stack panel. We're going to use this called my stack to actually attach our control to it. So we'll say like my stack add another control. Make sure that you understand lines 141 to 151. And that right there completes all the XAML for this project. We are about to begin main window XAML CS. This is the code behind for main window. Notice that we have 3 using statements, and then we're going to use our namespace. Then I'm actually using your project here, so I wanted to make sure it compiled, and you see that it is running. So this is a working app. Everything in here works. And, you know, the only thing you have to do now is, just make sure you type it in, take your time, and everything will work correctly. All right, cool. So where do we start? Well, we're going to say our 3 using statements, our namespace, and then we have our partial class main window, and it's going to inherit window. We're going to start off with CRUD, CRM CRUD equals CRUD. And then private data entry control equals data entry CTRL. Then we're going to get into our main window. Now this first line, line 16, that's by default. Microsoft just gives that to us. Then on line 10, we declare a variable. And here on line 18, we initiate it. So now CRUD is a working class. Then after we initiate that CRUD object, we're going to say load data entry control. Now we actually have to do a couple of things in there. Let's go down there and see what happens. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say my stack children clear. Do you remember in the XAML on main window how I had an empty stack? I want to make sure there are no children in there. Notice here the variable my stack. I want to make sure there are no children attached with this object. Then we're going to go out to the control, data entry control, and we're going to new up a new instance. Then using its two events, we're going to say, okay, here's the event name and here is the function. So a pointer to a function. Now these handlers are going to be used to subscribe to actions based on the control. So we newed up, we have our handlers handled, and now we're going to add that control to that stack, and we define that in main window.xaml. Now what I want to do is load up the form, and I want you to see this walk through. Let's just take our time. Step 1, we have a cancel button here. When someone clicks on that button, I'm going to call button cancel click. As you can see in button cancel click, I then have some code that says if on cancel handler not equal null, then raise this event. Now, this means someone has subscribed to it. On line 32, you can see that I have subscribed to that event handler. Now I have set a breakpoint in the data entry. I should get a breakpoint here, and I will get a breakpoint in the function that is going to be handling that action. In our first case, notice that we're on the control. I'm going to press on the cancel button, and notice it's going to come into this event, into this method. Cancel. Now the first thing this does is says on cancel error, is there a method that's associated with that? And it's saying yes. Look here, it's called data entry control on cancel handler. You can see that this is set up. Now what's going to happen is I'm actually calling that through the control, but now it's asking the entire app, is somebody handling this? Now when I go back to main window, notice that I have this data entry control on cancel handler. Now notice I have a breakpoint there. Now when I continue, I should actually come into this method. Let's continue. And notice that I'm in there. So now what it's going to do is going to clear that form, and I'm going to make it invisible. Let's continue that. Ready? F5. Notice the control is gone on our form. Well, not gone, it's just been hidden. Now notice in main, I have commented out my, hey, I will handle that for you. And then in the controller, when I'm on button click and it comes down there and says, hey, has someone subscribed? Is someone going to handle this event? If they are, let's go do that. But in main, I said, I don't want to do it. So this method down here will never get called. Let's see that happen. Let's now hit the cancel button. Notice I'm in there. Notice that says null. If on cancel handle not equal null, then I'm not going to do this. Watch, I'll just step right over that. Guess what? I can never make this go away now because it's not being handled. In main win, I commented out line 32. Now it doesn't, have anybody that wants to handle that event. Now, if I were to do this one as well, then it would never be able to do the insert, update, or delete. I'm not going to do that. I'm hoping that you understand line 32. I hope you understand its actions, and that is what's known as a delegate and event. So from continuing in main, we load up our entry, I clear it, I create the control, I attach the events, and then I take that control and I add it to that stack. I showed you where my stack is located in main window.xaml. Now after that, I make that data entry zone visible to collapsed, and then I refresh my grid. Now what does refresh grid mean? Notice on refresh grid, all I'm doing is I'm going getting all the display data, and we know that is CRMDTO. And then here's a very important fact. Whenever you're trying to repopulate a list, a grid, we have to say item source is null and then assign all the data to that. So you have to do both of these commands. Say you say, I'm going to outsmart this guy, and you leave off line 54, then you will see the error that I am talking about. Our next set of code on line 58 is button new record click. That means someone came to the form and clicked on this insert new record and insert record, and the ID field has been locked and the other fields are ready for me to start doing data entry. So I can say software nuggets, and my cell phone number is 111-111-1111. And then let's do an insert. Then I have my entry. Now, of course, I can edit that, change it, I can delete it, make it go away, and that's how that works. So in new record, you saw that I changed the data entry zone to visible. I changed the UI to create, remember the title bar and the button. I cleared out all the data entry form. I made it so we could do data entry in the text boxes. And then I created a new GUID. Notice here I say TBID equals GUID.newID to string, and that is in the data entry control. Let's make sure that you have lines 49 to 66 in your program. Press pause. Our last two buttons on the main window form are the edit and the delete button inside of the grid. We're talking about these edit and delete buttons here. Notice on every row, it gets its own button. Looking at the button edit and the button delete, the source code looks to be almost identical. When we run the app, notice when I hit edit, the text is available for me to make changes. Notice I'm making changes to these. But when I go into delete mode, notice that they are read-only. I cannot change them. The line that makes the difference there is line 85 on the edit control. I say set data is enabled to true. When I'm in delete mode, notice that I set it to false. So the source code for both of these is identical except that one line. Well, and line 83, notice here I set the UI type to edit mode, and here I'm setting it to UI delete mode. So I guess they are not the same. We're just passing in different parameters to the same set of functions. Let's make sure that you have lines 70 to 83 for the button button edit. Press pause now. And then let's go from line 89 to 107 for the button delete click command. Press pause now. Guess what, team? That's all the source code for main window XAML. I will start at the top and work my way down just to make sure you have all the source code. Let's start at the top from 1 to 24. Press pause now, make sure you have all the source code. Let's now go from 25 to 47. Press pause now. Continuing it at 48, we'll come to this 68, this region. Press pause now to line 68. From 70 to 88, the button edit. Press pause now. And to finish up the file, private delete all the way to line 113, which ends our program. And there you have it, team. There is all the source code for this project. I hope you were able to learn a thing or two. Hey team, and that's the end of this video. This video was about doing the CRUD commands on a JSON object, saving that object locally to your hard disk. Now, I also did a lot of programming about doing delegates. Notice that we used a custom control to gather, the contents, and then that was kind of disconnected from the base form. So we wrote a delegate to kind of let those two see each other, through messaging. Delegates are very powerful. I hope this video was able to show you how to use that. Now, this video took quite a while, and like the video, I'm not very good at it, so it takes me cut after cut after cut. But I believe this is my final version. If you appreciated this video, please give me a thumbs up. A lot of work went into this. And leave a comment and let me know kind of like how I did and what you'd like to see done better. I'd appreciate that. And of course, if you want to come back and get more videos from the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks again for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you back in my next video. Have a great week.